Good evening, distinguished guests. Welcome to the launch of Professor Terence Ho's launch of his third book, Future Ready Governance, Perspectives on Singapore and the World. I have the book here. The title of the book is Future Ready Governance, and it is perhaps fitting that we are launching this book at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy on the 101st birthday of Lee Kuan Yew. So he is a man who has completely embodied what it means to the concept of future-ready governance. So as the MC, I thought that it would be useful, other than giving you the usual pleasantries, I think it is apt that as an MC, I should give you a teaser of what you can expect from the book. I think it's worth its sticker price, but you'll be getting an exclusive discount today, courtesy of some bargaining from the school. And you will also get free refreshments as well. So I would say it's quite a good deal that you get today. So you should buy more books. So maybe I will start off with sharing of the 50 essays that you expect in the book, my favorite essay of the 50. And I thought that would be a useful frame to start today's event. So my favorite essay of the 50 would be number 24. The number 24th essay of this book is titled, Can Singapore Afford to Further Subsidize Public Buses and Trains? My answer as a consumer is obviously yes. In it, he posits that it's accessible public transportation that will further support our progress and in becoming a car-light society. And it will also create a ton of social benefits. And as I was reflecting on that and reflecting on the meaning of what it means, I figured that actually one of the benefits that I've come to enjoy is that now I can bring my grandma down to Gardens by the Bay directly through train, something that was previously unimaginable. I think 20 years ago you had to walk the sweltering heat, but today I can take the Thomson East Coast Line. So I thought that was a good example of a social benefit that I may come to enjoy from great access to public transport. He also argues that it's quite unlikely that further subsidies could result in overconsumption, and he highlights a 2013 trial that SMRT did. What was that 2013 trial? Well, you can read the book and find out. So, Prof. Terence's essay in this case talks about a vision of a car-like Singapore. And his essay actually encourages policymakers to look at policy challenges with fresh eyes. And throughout essay 1 to essay 50, I think that's what it invites the reader to do, to look at policy challenges with fresh eyes. So with that, I now have to invite Professor Terence up on the stage. Would you like me to reverse? Okay, so our guest of honor just came in. So I now have to read out the spiel that I had. That I prepared this morning, and now I have to embarrass him a little bit as well, on top of saying that he was late. So maybe for those who are unfamiliar, our guest of honor here today, he is a man who has also served in the public service for 36 years, and I think he is also a man who is familiar with the concept of embracing future-ready governance. When he was at the MAS, he spearheaded the positioning of establishing Singapore as a leading fintech hub. Back then, the word fintech, I think, was still not in the vocabulary of many yet. And he also accelerated the growth of our electronic payment system. In short, if you are enjoying the benefits of using PayNow today, I think you can thank Ravi Menon for it. He also initiated a regulatory sandbox to promote digital experimentation in the financial industry, and he also oversaw the introduction of digital banking licenses in Singapore. In short, he has helped enable Singapore to not just become a finance hub, but also a fintech hub. But he is not relying on his laurels. I read in the news earlier this year that he was retiring. But earlier this morning, Terence corrected me. He said, no, he's not retiring. He found a new job. And just like Terence also found a new job here at the Lee Kuan Yew School. So these two men also embrace, to a certain extent, what it means to not rest on your laurels. And what I found out also was that he went from regulating our financial markets, which is already a very difficult thing, to helping to mitigate challenges of climate change on both a national and global level. Talk about scaling up. So with that, I would like to invite our fashionably late, no, I'm just kidding, our fashionable Ambassador Ravi up on stage to give his opening remarks. Ambassador Ravi, please.
Thanks. Apple. Thank you. Thank you, Keith. Thank you. I'd still like to think I am retired, or at least fashionably retired. Doing a variety of things, of which climate is one. But today, we're not here to talk about that. Today, we're here to commend and celebrate the remarkable book that Terence Ho has written. It's remarkable because it combines so well the nuts and bolts of policy making and management that only a seasoned practitioner like Terence can bring, but also the deeper conceptual frameworks and principles that are exemplified in these policies and practices that an intellectual can bring. And Terence, as you know, is both a practitioner of policy as well as an intellectual who thinks deeply about these policies. And he's managed to write, I think, a very highly accessible book. I've read it in parts, and it's easy to relate to. It's simple. And at the same time, it's a huge, veritable reference on a wide range of public policies and programs in Singapore. It is, of course, with the rapid rate of change in policies, books like these tend to get outdated very quickly. But if you want to have a snapshot as of today, I think it is one of the best out there in terms of the collection of areas that it has covered. Only thing is Terence will have to update that book every year to keep it current, which I'm sure he's fully capable of. One of the themes in his book, and what we are going to talk about here, is good governance. And we've talked a lot about that, especially in this place. Good governance is vital for any country to survive and thrive in a volatile, uncertain environment. And especially for small city-states like Singapore, I think it is critical. Before I get on, by governance, I don't mean government. I think there's a big difference between the two. And I think especially in Singapore, we tend to conflate the two. And when we speak of governance, we often think about government. Well, government is an important part of governance, but it doesn't exist in isolation. And truly good governance goes well beyond government. And I think that's something we need to focus our minds on. And governance cannot be static. It's especially as it's not entirely to do with governments, because the governments of the day change. Governance is something that needs to continually evolve. And I think that has been one of our hallmarks here in Singapore. Whether it will continue to do that, we don't know, right? The past is not a guarantee of the future. But the fact that it has evolved continually, it's sometimes not well appreciated. Beyond the fundamentals like trust, integrity, excellence, the practice of good governance must evolve with the times. Change is integral to good governance. And you'll find in Terence's book many examples and clues about that evolving governance structure and how policies have continually adapted and evolved. And in a place like Singapore, where we don't make big changes, sometimes they're not noticeable. But you take it over a period of years, the cumulative changes in some areas can be quite impressive, quite significant. I want to offer a few thoughts, just a couple of thoughts, more by way of introduction, and I'm looking forward to the discussion later and with you. A few thoughts on governance for the future. Things that we probably can do better at, right? There are many things governance here does well, but I want to focus on two things that we can probably do better, especially when it comes to preparing for the future. One is to foster innovation while managing the risks, no doubt. There can be no excellence without innovation. And innovation has not been alien to Singapore. Much of what we've achieved in the past has been due to innovations. For the future, I think good governance is about anticipating change, preparing for it. We've heard this many times, rather than just reacting to it and coping with it. But even better governance would be about seeking to change, seeking to influence that change, and seeking to shape that change. A few things that we would do well to bear in mind. One is to not wait for certainty. It seems like an obvious statement to make, But I think there is a risk, and this is not just in the public domain, but also in the private sector, that sometimes the lack of certainty or information or enough information retards or paralyzes action. And that itself is actually taking some risk. So I think to wait for change, wait for certainty, especially in uncertain times, is futile. Anticipating change does not mean guessing exactly what's going to happen. It's not about forecasting. It is about imagining alternative futures and preparing for those alternatives. It is about operating with a view for tomorrow, not just today. I will cite examples, but you will forgive me if my examples come fair amount from the financial sector, which is what I'm most familiar with, given my past work. But I think some of those principles, some of those ideas are worth reflecting on. Keith talked about MAS and FinTech. When we started that journey in 2015, actually few people knew what FinTech meant. We just had a sense that this time, technology was going to make fundamental changes in the financial landscape. And we not only had to prepare for such a future because it is rapidly happening, and it could disrupt us and affect us in ways that we can't imagine, but we had an opportunity to shape that future if we moved early. And this was still early days in 2015 when the word FinTech was still not in the popular imagination. And most important was to simply signal that we were open to innovation, even if we didn't know all the different directions that innovation was going to take us. But that we were open to innovation, we were open to experimentation, and we were also open to the occasional failure in those experiments. And I think that is one spirit that future governance may want to embrace, because we are going to be confronted with even bigger tectonic shifts in technology. Artificial intelligence progressing at a very rapid pace. Quantum computing, we still do not know the contours of what that means. And many other technologies out there that are rapidly changing. And we are not going to be able to stop it. And it's not wise to stop it because they can harness many benefits. But it's important to move ahead even with this uncertainty. Future-ready governance is not about being fail-safe. It is about being safe-fail. It's not about preventing failure, because that would stifle innovation. It is about failing safely, setting boundaries to limit the effects of failure. And that is what the regulatory sandboxes for experiments seek to do. I sometimes worry that there is a rise in risk aversion in Singapore, not isolated to the government or the public service. It is a mutually reinforcing risk aversion across the citizenry, across the media, intelligentsia, and then government as well. And it feeds on each other and one another. A deep anxiety about things going wrong and therefore not wanting to try new things. So that, I think, is something we need to watch for. The other thing is principles must not become dogma or ideology that stand in the way of change. And now I think, especially in a place like this, and of course, when we look back at our last 55 years or 59 years, we've distilled many of the tenets of past successes. We've kind of coded them, set them down as principles, and we tell each other and remind one another what those principles are. And that's all fine, because principles have served us well. They've served as a useful compass, not just in the past, but even as we navigate uncertain new era, they've served us well. But if we become too literally attached to these principles and believe that they are sacrosanct in some way, then there will be little room for innovation and change. So we must constantly refresh and update the way in which our principles are applied. And that means understanding the principles at a much deeper level, and so that we can keep up with new challenges and change circumstances. Take, for instance, the principle, Some would have said it was a principle about 10 or 15 years ago. No unemployment benefits. In many ways, at its core, it remains a sound principle. You just look at the damaging effects such schemes have had on eroding the work ethic, creating a dependency culture, and so on. But in the 2000s, to address the issue of low wages, the government introduced a workfare income supplement. In other words, after a lot of soul searching, the principle was refreshed. Benefits are fine if they're conditional on work, but it was a way to give basically handouts, cash handouts, as a wage supplement to those who are working, but whose wages were still very low. And now we've gone even further. Just earlier this year, we heard the announcement the government is looking to expand temporary training support for the involuntarily unemployed to find jobs, to find new jobs. It's not quite an unemployment benefit. You're not getting the benefit because you're unemployed. You're involuntarily unemployed for a short time. You need new skills to take on new jobs, but in the interim, what do? And so this measure comes in. In other words, the underlying principle remains. There's no unconditional, universal unemployment benefit scheme. But the government has refreshed it continually to deal with issues like low-wage workers and skills inadequacies for new jobs. So this becomes a bridging finance while he equips himself for the new jobs. We've got to think of examples like these in many areas, and not to take too literally what we think are principles, but actually underlying them are deeper truths, which we need to recognize. The other thing to bear in mind, managing change carefully doesn't always mean managing it gradually. Sometimes it does, but not always. It's become quite fashionable these days to talk about calibrated changes. If I'm not mistaken, the meaning of the word calibrated in physics means very small and very tiny, very carefully measured. Small steps are sometimes appropriate. That's exactly the way we need to do some things. But in other instances, larger shifts may be necessary, and we should not desist from taking them. And in some areas, I think we have, but in other areas, we have taken bolder steps. Positive example, raising carbon tax fivefold, from $5 per ton of CO2 to $25 per ton of CO2, with plans to double or triple that by 2030, which is just 6 years away. That is bold, because that's what is required. Getting the price of carbon right is so critical for the decarbonization efforts that we need to take as part of our transition to net zero. There is risk in incrementalism, in moving too slowly. The world around us may not operate the same way. Good governance is about knowing when to move fast. Take, for example, the liberalization of telecommunications and financial services in the 1990s and early 2000s. I think the preference would have been for a more gradual approach, but external changes, the rapid pace of industrial change and technological change, forced us to move much faster than our initial timelines. So sometimes speed is of the essence in managing change. Agile frameworks and services that can adapt quickly to changes in society and technology. This also means, and that's why I say governance is not just about governance, but the larger ecosystem that makes the management of issues and problems optimal. That is an area that needs to be cognizant of this. And sometimes businesses or governments don't move fast enough because of pressure from stakeholders or concerns about how the people might react. And this is a very careful framework to bear in mind. The COVID-19 example is in some ways illustrative. When the circumstances change, you change your approach. When the circumstances change very rapidly and ding-dong, then your policies and programs and approaches also do the same. So many people are frustrated by that. Why are we changing so many times? Well, but the situation is changing so many times. If the threat seems to have subsided, we wait for a while. Okay, why do we want to keep people restrained and locked up? we liberalize, we open up. But then the threat resurfaces again in a new form. You have to hold back, you have to pull back. I think good governance means all parts of society being nimble enough, being fluid enough to accommodate to changes, frequent changes. And when the whole ecosystem is ready for it, then the government can act more boldly. Otherwise, the government feels restrained. The second thing I want to talk about, and that's the other thought for the new partnership, which we need to do better, new governance, is to forge synergistic partnerships to co-create solutions. I go back to where I started. Government is not governance. To solve the multifaceted, wicked problems of the future, you will require unprecedented levels of collaboration across the public, private, and people sectors. The climate challenge is the most striking example of a collective failure by all parties, right? And it's very fashionable to blame one another. Every one of us is to blame. And it demands a collective action solution. That's the only way we're going to solve it. And those countries that implement successful partnership models of governance, harnessing the strength of the public, private, and people sectors, they will thrive in the future. And this is one of our governance challenges that we need to get right. I think good steps are being made in that direction, but the instincts and the muscles need further tending and nurturing. So if you take the climate challenge itself, government's role, put in place policies, imposing a price of carbon, setting emissions standards, regulations. That alone will not be enough. Financial institutions need to direct financing to green and transition projects. Scientists and technologists need to improve the economics and scalability of clean energy solutions. Because much of what goes on in the technology world has a logic and has a dynamic of its own. The industry needs to deploy cleaner technologies. Work processes need to adjust. Workers need to be adjusted, need to be prepared for the green transition. It's a multifaceted collective action. People themselves, ultimately, people themselves need to adjust their consumption choices to adopt a less carbon-intensive or less energy-intensive lifestyle. So partnerships also need to be established across borders. That's even more challenging. But given our small size is both an advantage and disadvantage, we can't corral others, and yet because of our small size, we're not a threat. We can try to bring others together to the table to forge these partnerships, especially in a climate where the international geopolitics is so fractured and dysfunctional. You need small efforts across borders, public-private partnerships across borders, like-minded parties to make small changes that can then escalate and cascade. The governance of the future will therefore be less directive, more collaborative. It has to be less transactional and more relational. A more active citizenry is not cause for despair. It's a sign of a maturing society and offers a prospect, if well harnessed, for a more effective and impactful governance in which the citizenry is part of that governance process. It also underscores the growing importance of public communication, transparency. Effective communication is not just a matter of skills and capabilities. It is not about spin. It is about authenticity and empathy. So, to close, I think we also might want to think about governance. It's not often talked about, but we also want to think about governance that is values-based and purpose-driven. Focusing on values helps to clarify many of our policy choices, which are increasingly tough to make. If we want to raise the income levels at the bottom half of the workforce, then it means reducing the intake of low-wage, low-skilled foreign workers. If you do that, that is going to lead to a rise in costs. One person's wage is another person's cost, which means we have to decide, if we want a more inclusive society, we have to pay for it. We have to be prepared to pay for it collectively, and then find ways how you can share that burden. But we can't have the cost structures of the third world and have first world wages. Likewise, if we want to promote innovation, we must cut slack. We must cut the government some slack, the government must cut industry some slack, people must be cut some slack to have the occasional failures crop up, and to be forgiving, and to learn from the experience, and to move on. So these are all values-based. It depends on how much we value innovation, how much we value inclusion, how much we value sustainability. And focusing on values such as resilience, sustainability, delayed gratification can promote long-term orientation. This is so sorely lacking in the world today. The long-term orientation that people need to take to solve the problems of today, whether it's a debt crisis or the climate crisis, taking that long-term orientation is key. And finally, good governance encompasses both good management and good old-fashioned leadership. Good management is about harnessing resources, managing process, fighting crisis, delivering results. Those are the tangible outward manifestations of governance. Good leadership is about leading change, focusing on innovation, empowering people, forging partnerships, and inspiring through a sense of shared purpose, focused on the collective good and the long-term good. Collective good, what we do for others collectively. The long-term good, what we do for our future. And lest we not forget, governance for the future is not about doing it alone, but doing it together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Ravi. So we'd like to invite you to stay on stage as we invite Terence and Ms. Cheryl to... I'd like to invite Ambassador Ravi to be joined by Professor Terence and Ms. Cheryl Chong to come on the stage and unveil the book. So now you can take out your iPhones, maybe your Huawei, and 3, 2, 1. Round of applause, please. So with the book officially launched, we'd like to invite Professor Terence Ho to just come on stage and give us his address. Thank you.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon to everyone. Now, not too long ago, after Michelle Obama had delivered a very rousing speech, her husband, Barack Obama, had this to say. He said, wryly, that he was the only person stupid enough, in his words, to speak after Michelle Obama. But thanks to Ambassador Ravi's timely arrival, I find myself in this position now, being the foolish enough to be speaking after Ravi has shared so eloquently his insights into what makes for good future-ready governance. And I think these are insights that resonate a lot. I hadn't seen his speech and the points he's going to cover before today, so I'm glad that we could have him here with us. Thank you, Ravi. I also want to thank Ms. Cheryl Chung for agreeing to moderate the discussion that follows later. And for those of you who may not be familiar, Cheryl is a very seasoned and a leading practitioner of foresight and futures thinking, and very well known to the Lee Kuan Yew School community. Thanks also to Keith Yap, for agreeing to MC today's event. Keith is a proud alumnus of the Lee Kuan Yew School as well as Yale NUS College. And he's recently set up a company that does podcasts of thought leaders in Singapore. So among this very eminent group of guests here, don't be surprised if you get a call from Keith asking you to feature in his podcast. I want to thank all of you for making the time to join me here at the Lee Kuan Yew School, because I know that many of you are very busy people. And I include among this group the students of the Lee Kuan Yew School, those of you who are here with us. I know you have many assignments to juggle, midterms, coursework, so thank you for being here. I'm also very glad that my wife, Grace, is able to join this time, because she didn't manage to make it to my book launch last year, so thank you all. Of course, I need to also mention the Lee Kuan Yew School for hosting this event, and the wonderful team led by Andrea for making this event possible, to my publishers, World Scientific, Yulin, and Amy being here as well. And the editors from the media, I think a few of you are here, Su-Ling, Alison, thank you so much for making this book possible. So let me start off by introducing my book. It's a collection of 50 opinion pieces, articles, written for the media organizations in Singapore for the past 2 years. Now, I write quite on an eclectic range of subjects. Any issue of the day, public policy I've written about. So why the title of this book, Future Ready Governance? Well, to the extent that any public policy is about bettering lives, not just today, but into the future, I guess that everything I've written about somehow relates to future-oriented governance. So many of you, of course, have spent much time thinking about the future in your respective domains, and individually and certainly collectively, you know a lot more about the future than I am. So in the short time I have here, I'd like to complement the insights that Ambassador Ravi has kindly shared with my own very small framework based on my perspective here at the school on the key elements, I think, of what makes for governance that's future-ready. And to keep things simple, I've distilled it to just 4 actions, each beginning with the letter A. And the first is to, of course, anticipate change. And this is very self-evident to most of us. The only way that we can prepare for the future is to have some inkling of what the future may bring. And there's a whole slew of tools and methodologies which Cheryl and Jeanette as well from the Center for Strategic Futures, they can tell you much more about in terms of how governments, including the Singapore government, tries to think ahead and plan for the future. Now, Singapore has had quite a long history with scenario planning, which began in the 1980s, I think in MINDEF, taking inspiration from what Shell had used very successfully in the 1970s. I think Jeanette is smiling at this. So allow me a very, very brief history. I think by the 1990s, this was then embraced by the rest of the public sector. And in 1997, if I get my dates right, the first set of national scenarios was launched. Now, these scenarios are not meant to be predictions about the future of any certainty, but I just meant to paint a plausible picture of what could impact Singapore significantly in the years ahead. And the first set of national scenarios was so memorable that to this day, I remember a couple of the names. I'm just going to share one very briefly, which is Hotel Singapore. It describes a Singapore that is very successful economically, a vibrant global city, but where citizens don't feel a very strong attachment or sense of belonging. So they treat this place like a transit stop, a hotel. So that's just one illustration of the national scenarios. And over the years, other foresight tools have been adopted by the government to complement scenario planning. These include things like risk assessment, horizon scanning, and many other tools. And the aim is to be able to discern, to identify some of the weak signals that could potentially grow into something that significantly affects our future. What I like about CSF, I'm going to go back to CSF again, methodology, is that in prioritizing these various issues that they're identified, they look not just at the 2 obvious dimensions of the likelihood of something occurring and the impact if it were to occur, but also the extent of institutional surprise if it occurs. That's how ready our public agencies, and not just our public agencies, but as what Ravi mentioned, the rest of society and community are to deal with such surprises. And we know, of course, that nobody can predict the future with any certainty at all. There will always be black swan events that will catch us by surprise, which is why I think that the second of my 4 A's is probably the most critical, which is the ability to adapt nimbly. And of course, we have been through the recent pandemic, which illustrates that very well. Back in 2003, the SARS crisis did help to shape our initial response to the COVID-19 pandemic. But as we often say, we should not be caught in an old paradigm or be fighting the last war. And so indeed, there were significant differences between SARS and COVID-19 pandemic. And one of these was the importance of temperature screening, which we all know was very important during SARS, but perhaps had a less prominent role because the COVID-19 virus could be spread even by people who are not exhibiting fever. And of course, most of us will remember the change in the government's stance on the wearing of face masks in public. At the early phase of the COVID-19 pandemic, the advice was only wear a mask if you're feeling unwell or entering a healthcare setting. This was partly because of the need to ration masks at the beginning when they were in short supply. But once the evidence became quite clear that wearing masks could slow down the airborne transmission of the virus, then I think the government took a decisive move, not one that was incremental or calibrated, but to mandate basically that mask wearing was required in public. So the ability to adapt nimbly is so critical in many contexts which are similar to COVID-19. Some people have described this as being a complex kind of environment or context. People familiar with the work of Dave Snowden would know. And in this environment, we cannot have all the facts at our fingertips before we make a decision. neither can we rely on established best practices. Rather, we need to probe the environment, to sense and then respond, and to dial up or down or do something differently depending on the situation. Now, the third A I'm going to share about is the importance of accumulating assets and expanding our options to deal with whatever the future may throw at us. And a prime example of this is Singapore's reserves. The past reserves serve, among other functions, as a rainy day fund. And beyond our financial resources, of course, we have accumulated stockpiles of other essentials like food, medical supplies, and so on. Another manifestation of this is in planning for program budgets across many years. It's always prudent to leave aside some white space or buffer to deal with contingencies as well as opportunities that may arise. In planning for infrastructure too, we need to bear in mind the need for optionality or options. And one example I'm going to give is from our MRT lines, which have been, our MRT network has expanded over the years to serve new HDB towns that have arisen. And of course, being prudent, one should not over-cater for train capacity before ridership has reached its peak. So with the train length, the number of train cars is sized according to the expected demand. But what happens if we don't plan for extra platform space is that if there's a need to increase the number of train cars for the future, it would be very, very costly to then have to retrofit and redesign the MRT stations. And in COVID-19, of course, another example would be the need for a lot of quarantine and testing facilities and space. In peacetime, we cannot afford to set aside all the space just for the emergency use. So what we need for options are dual-use infrastructure, whose use can be pivoted to these facilities when the need arises. And picking up on Ravi's point as well on the importance of partnership. If the public sector can tap on private sector hospital beds, which we do, if we can have agreements with hotels, service apartments, and the owners of exhibition and convention spaces, then we can readily obtain the infrastructure when we need it. The final A I'm going to talk about is the need to acquire expertise. So the Singapore government is already looking ahead to the future energy or power needs, which are expected to grow. And even though we have not made a firm decision on the adoption of nuclear power, there have already been efforts for several years which will be stepped up further to train up experts and increase our expertise in all aspects of nuclear power management. And the areas which, again, Ravi has talked about in sustainability, in fintech, there's so many new technologies that regulators have to keep abreast of in order to regulate this effectively. Finally, I would say that beyond the technical expertise, we need people who can connect the dots across domains, because this will be really the key to anticipating and responding nimbly. So I've talked about the 4 A's, which to me are the what, or the key elements of future-ready governance. But I'd like to also reiterate the why and the how, which I think also reflects the points that Ambassador Ravi has raised. And the why is really important. It's about creating a more sustainable and inclusive future, without which I think no success can be sustained for any country, including Singapore. And the how is to do with partnerships again. It's not the public sector acting alone, but how we empower and enable and partner the individuals, households, businesses, community organizations, and the people sector in shaping the governance of the future. Thank you all. That's all I have to say. I look forward very much to the discussion moderated by Cheryl.
Thank you, Prof. Terence. We'd like to now invite Ms. Cheryl Chong and Ambassador Ravi up on stage. So please give us some time as our team also put together the easel. Ms. Cheryl, please. And we'd also like to invite Ambassador Ravi up to the stage so that we could proceed the dialogue.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. I think both Terence and Ravi have given us such wonderful food for thought, and I hope that that's really kind of sparked a number of questions in your mind and responses, and we'll be opening up to the floor for Q&A shortly. But it's my job as the moderator to keep the conversation going, and maybe start the ball off. So by way of short introduction, my name is Cheryl Chung. For the purpose of today, you just need to know that I'm the moderator. But as Terence mentioned, I specialize in futures, and this topic obviously is of great interest to me. But this occasion of Terence's book launch, as a dear former colleague at the Lee Kuan Yew School, it's really a wonderful opportunity to have a conversation about future-ready governance. But the other part that really brings me a lot of joy is that actually Mr. Menon was my permanent secretary in my first futures job at the Ministry of Trade and Industry a very, very long time ago. So it's a wonderful time to be able to connect both with longtime colleagues as well as all of you. I think I wanted to pick up on one of the conversations that we were talking about earlier. So, the book is, of course, as you mentioned, to use your word, Terence, eclectic collection of different essays over a wide-ranging topics. But what I hear what I read in the book, and also what I heard from Ravi earlier, was this underlying thread, of the way you think about the future. That's not going to come up in the book, and I think in the occasion of the launch, I would really love to hear from the both of you. This conversation around not just the what, of future-ready governance, but also how do we continue to make sure that we are ready, a future ready over time. I'd be very curious as to your own personal reflections, on how you do that over your career, and maybe we can start with you, Ravi, and then we can go to Terence. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think to some extent, both Terence and I kind of touched on it in our remarks, which is that the future is inherently difficult to predict. Although one wise man said, actually, the past is more difficult to understand than predicting the future. But leaving that philosophical thought aside, it's inherently difficult. I spent an early part of my career doing economic forecasting, macroeconomic models, running equations. Yeah, it's intellectually very satisfying. And it does have policy applications, because you do need to have a sense of where the economy is heading when you make. But you also realize through those exercises, the cone of uncertainty is extremely large. A lot depends on the assumptions and that are being made. And so I think the way to think about the future is to think, as Terence very usefully pointed out, and I just touched on it, but I think he elaborated on it, is to think in terms of scenarios. There's a certain discipline in scenario planning. You identify what are the driving forces, and then you figure out what might be the branching points. And then depending on how the branching points go, you have a scenario emerging. You don't try to attach probabilities, because that is tricky. But you look at how these different things can pan out in different ways. And then you ask, am I reasonably well placed, robustly placed enough to handle these different situations? And I think the other thing is that you can have a better sense of things like demographics, because it's already cooked. You can have a better sense of, well, climate change is already happening. It's going to get worse. You don't need rocket science to establish that. What we don't know are how extensive and what the effects will be in different parts of the world. So I think you can have those as markers, and then from there you can work out how you want to prepare for yourself. Actually, this is not new. Why are we asking this about countries and societies and businesses? Do any of us know what's in store for our future, our personal futures? We don't. There are so many unknowns, from health to wealth to external circumstances to relationships to careers. You have rough ideas, but a lot of things that can change. And how do we prepare for it? We prepare through resilience, through being able to adapt to whatever life throws at us. And to some extent, that's what we need to do at the larger scale.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you.
Thanks. I don't so much have a methodology. Of course, we need to piece together the sort of quantitative data as well as qualitative trends. But maybe I'll just talk about how I'll approach my conversations with people whom I think could help to shape my view of the future. I usually try to start off with just hearing what's on the other person's mind. This person could be an expert in an area. I would just like to hear what are their concerns, what keeps them up at night. And I might then probe them a bit on some topics which I think they may have an interesting view on. So these could be controversial topics where there are different views being expressed. And I'd like to get their sense of the issue. And if they say something that is contrary to the received wisdom or that goes a bit further, this is when I would probe further to try to tease out some of the insights. And finally, after some time, I would form my own hypothesis. And I like to also sometimes run it by them. It could be a provocative one, but just to get a reaction to see how what I'm saying, whether it makes sense to this person. And that's how I like to approach it.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, I think what I'm really hearing is this fundamental agency towards the future, right? That it is about both preparing for the future and as well as creating a future that you want, and this decision-making under uncertainty and ability to make decisions under uncertainty and not be stuck in analysis paralysis, I think is also critical. Yeah, wonderful. I mean, we are all amongst friends and both new friends as well as old friends. This is maybe a good time to start to open up the conversation to all of you. I see a gentleman has already stood up. But if I can just invite you to let us know who you are, if you can just introduce yourself. Let us know who the question is directed to, if you can, and just keep your question brief. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'm Paul Tambaya from the medical school. I'm here in my own capacity. My question is directed to Mr. Menon. I found the IPS Nathan lectures that you gave for the school very, very interesting. And in fact, my wife used them for her students. And in particular, the issue of minimum wage, which you correctly pointed out that we kind of have a third world wage structure, which is going to be very hard to continue. But you did point out the transition costs. And I think you kind of reiterated that point about the costs that will have to be paid if we do introduce some kind of minimum wage. But my question as a non-economist is whether we look at the benefits, actually, the economic benefits. And I'm thinking of the CDC vouchers and the fact that these are used in heartland stores. The hawkers will advertise that they accept CDC vouchers. So people who previously would not have eaten out have the ability to do that. And if you raise the wages of the lower income Singaporeans, whether you're actually stimulating the small and medium enterprises or the people on the ground. And so the transition cost may not be as high as it appears. That's just my question. Thank you.
Okay, I didn't expect to be talking about minimum wage on Terence's launch.
Well, the Pope talked about it.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this for decades, and I think I also mentioned during the panel, the Q&A after that with Chua Mui Hong, that I've changed my mind on the minimum wage 3 times in my professional career. Like most economist students, I started being against it. There are, very strong theoretical reasons and some empirical research that suggests that the balance of effects tend to be negative, especially for employment. So that was a long-held view. And then I kept reading about it. And then there was more empirical evidence that actually it all depends not on the minimum wage, but where you set it. The answer, really, a good economist will tell you it's not yes or no, but where are you going to set it? If you set it too high, the negative effects will be strong. If you set it too low, you don't get much benefits. So where is that golden mean? Does it exist? And that depends on the labor market in which you're operating. So the answer becomes a lot more complex, and you started seeing more evidence and arguments in favor of it. That it has not had those bad effects. As you point out, the transitional costs were absorbed quite well. So I changed my mind. Then I think with even greater maturity, I switched back to my old view because of what, in policy making you call the slippery slope effect, that once you introduce that, and then if you don't have a discipline of how you adjust it, the pressures grow to raise it to levels that then create economic hardships. And you see that getting politicized in many societies. So that's a tragedy, that sometimes good policies, you can't implement them because they tend to get overdone. And you see that happening in some countries with very bad effects. So I thought, no, on balance, this is not a great idea. The potential costs are large. And the benefits, and this is something that's not well appreciated, that it's not going to solve the inequality problem. It's not going to solve the inclusion problem. All it does is raise the wages at the bottom, and then it have cascading effects on the next 2 or 3 deciles, but that's just about it. It doesn't change the whole income distribution. The more impactful measures to change the whole income distribution is to raise productivity at every level and wages at every level. And that's what the progressive wage model tries to do. The progressive wage model, by the way, is a clever way to introduce a sectoral minimum wage and then to have a ladder or an escalation above it, which I thought was better, which I thought was superior. Then much more recently, I changed my mind again because, as you say, the cost is not large. Because the progressive wage model takes a long time to implement, and you've got to go sector by sector, establish skills ladders, competency levels, and so on, so that people can rise through. They don't get stuck at the minimum wage. That's not what we want. You want people to rise, firstly, to raise them to the minimum wage, and then rise above that. But this is a huge task. The unions and the government and the employers have been working very hard at this. And so I thought, well, in the interim, why don't we have a minimum wage that sets a basic floor, and then you can take your time with the progressive wage model, which I think is the better long-term solution, not the minimum wage. But it doesn't hurt to have one while we are building the PWM in earnest. That's my current view. I may change my mind again in 2 years' time. So it goes to Terence's point. I think we should hold our convictions lightly. Yeah. These are all testable hypotheses. You keep testing hypotheses against new evidence and new data. You introduce an idea, not because you are very sure it is the correct one, but because that is your current hypothesis based on your current data. And you've got to continually challenge ourselves. This is also a part of good governance. Yeah. Being able to hold our convictions lightly, test them against evidence and data, and be willing to change our minds. Sometimes not once, not twice, but 3 times and more.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really this decision-making uncertainty, right, and the challenges of doing that. I see a hand towards the back. Yes, you. Thank you.
I love how Terence actually spoke about controversial topics. I think this is a bit controversial. Given how future-ready governance requires future-ready talents, would it make sense to change our scholarship system, whereby the frozen middle tends to be the gatekeepers for innovation, at least from my personal experience? And for context, I've never worked for government. They don't want me. I'm a private sector guy. Just to get your view. Thank you.
Shall I go? So I think the suggestion is whether we should broaden maybe the sort of selection of scholarship holders to, I think so. I think there's some efforts in doing so already. Over the years, we have seen that they come from different educational streams. Some of them are studying topics which in the past may be considered really impractical. But today, I think we are trying to broaden that diversity. But I think more could be done to really induct into government people from a wide variety of different backgrounds and experiences, because the nature of society is becoming so different, so diverse and heterogeneous. And the public sector offices as well should reflect, I think, that kind of diversity. Of course, some of the diversity is not just in background, but also the flexibility that they have on the job to be able to surface, different views, divergent views if necessary as well, and how well these are then discussed, debated within government. So I think it's always a function partly of the background of a person's life experiences, but also the environment that he or she is in, whether it fosters that kind of innovation and bringing different things to the table.
would love to see, I mean, you mentioned earlier, this idea of greater partnerships, right? And I would love to see an angle to that question, which also involves the people sector and the private sector, and actually just working more closely together and broadening this idea of what future-ready governance looks like, which I think was the point that both of you made. Thanks so much. Maybe let's go to the lady at the back. Hi, welcome.
Hi, thank you for the sharing. I'm Phoebe, graduated from the public policy program from LKY and now engaged in the fintech regulations at work. So my question is, in this such emerging dynamic fintech industry, how to track the balance between safe, secure regulation and innovative market in terms of ready good governance. For example, I think Singapore is one of the leading ones to introduce the digital payment DPT license, which really attract many use cases in the market. However, I feel there is a term of transition of the regulatory attitude due to some anti-money laundering concerns and crime cases. So the market now is shrinking a little bit. So I'm thinking how to track this kind of balance from the good governance. Thank you.
Well, the answer would sound cliched. It's a matter of continually striking a balance between the two. Some basic things we followed is, like I mentioned, that don't wait for full certainty. Because if you're going to wait for certainty on exactly how digital payments are going to work, the world would have moved ahead. Imagine if we had gone into COVID-19 pandemic without an electronic payment system, which was integrated with e-commerce and food deliveries and so on. If we didn't have that, if COVID-19 had hit us 5 years earlier or 10 years earlier, we would have been so much more disruptive. So, do we know all the risks? No, but this was the way to go. And of course, you have risks like anti-money laundering risks, so we have to make sure that even in the payments authentication process, when you onboard, there is a check against the bank account, and the bank is supposed to have done that due diligence. So if you have a new fintech player who can't do that due diligence, you're supposed to verify that person's identity with a bank account, which is why they will ask you to send $1 and then deposit $1, because then it verifies that the bank has an account with you. So there are ways in which you try to do this. The scams are an unfortunate thing. Scams, they're payment scams that people use. Deception has always been around, but now we're using digital means. It has hurt many people. And these are the people who can least afford to actually suffer these losses. So almost everything that we do, there is risk. Yeah. But if you seriously ask, do we want to retreat for e-payments and go back to checks and cash? I don't think any of us want to do that. We just have to manage these risks better and better as time goes on. The motor car industry is a good example. When the automobile was first introduced, if you track the number of fatalities on the roads and pedestrian deaths, it's mind-boggling. This was before traffic lights. This was before safety standards were built into cars, before seat belts, before a whole paraphernalia of things that we built up since then. If you look at air travel, the same thing. How has it become from a fairly hazardous mode of transport to being the safest today? Have we eliminated air crashes? No. But we've made the probability so low with so many safeguards and guardrails in place. And this is how we need to adopt new technologies, not to be afraid. And I would say this for artificial intelligence too, to embrace the use of these, use as much as, and try to anticipate, but you cannot anticipate all of it. Try to anticipate as much of the risks, put in guardrails, and as you move along, you realize more and more, and then you start layering on additional regulations. If you try too hard, that stifles innovation. Yeah. So I would always say regulation should just be one step behind innovation. Keep a close step behind, and as the risks emerge, try to address them. This may look unsatisfactory to some people who don't want to see anything bad happen. But if you try to take that approach, you will have to over-regulate in order to control things. So I think in many areas of fintech, and we're going to see this increasingly in quantum and in artificial intelligence, this striking of the balance is going to be extremely challenging.
Absolutely. I'm currently doing a project on the future of RegTech with another government. And of course, they're very inspired by the MAS experience. You know, and one of the things that came out very strongly in that experience is the process of learning that happens, right? That both government kind of undertakes also with industry, you know, because nobody has a monopoly on what the future is going to be. We're all learning, and if we can enter into a process of learning together, actually that's incredibly powerful as well. Yeah, thanks so much. Maybe I can take this question in the front, if you don't mind. Oh, yeah, we can probably hear you if you don't mind.
Thank you. I have a question on governance. I think earlier on today, also in fact, Ravi and both panelists have reminded us that governance is more than just government. So my question will be related to the issue of the mutually reinforcing role between government and the non-government players, private sector, and also the community. But before that, I'd like to just say that I am very happy with the way you handle the question about minimum wages. I was from government, not from opposition. So I won't ask a question about ministers' salaries. But instead, I'd like to ask, in terms of the role of government and non-government players, can you share with us, we know government has been so strong, PAP, we know what it's all about. Strong government that led the way, planted the seeds of the future of Singapore. But what is the role of non-government sectors, including our multiracial players? Multiracial is an important part of Singapore, multiracialism, important part of Singapore. How did the private sector and the community contribute to the government's thinking and formalizing the future-ready essence of governance? Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you very much.
Maybe I'll have a go first. I think the role, of course, of the other partners in the community is really growing. And I think maybe in the past, the government would make some plans and decisions and then just rope in the people sector or the private sector to help, implement some of these things, because to help with the communications or just implementation. But increasingly, the partnership is, I think, evolving upstream as well. And I'm so glad that Michael Lian could join us as well, because his organization has also been involved in discussions around policies such as workfare. And I think that's also a vital part of this ongoing discourse, that at every stage of the policy process, from upstream planning and formulating to implementation, there's involvement. And recently, there was also a very successful youth forum where the young people, too, could participate in sharing their vision for Singapore. And as we discussed earlier, I think that it's really, the buy-in will be a lot stronger for subsequent implementation and rollout if people are involved at all stages of the policy process. So just my 2 cents worth.
I think over the years, there's been a definite improvement in the degree of consultation and engagement that the government has undertaken with non-government players. In many, many spheres that I'm aware of, there is very active consultation, feedback gathering, and engagement. I think to stretch your question, what you are really getting at is moving from consultation to co-creation. Yeah. I think that is the next challenge. I think the government has begun to do that in some ways. As I mentioned, I think the instinct and muscles, it's not a muscle you've built up very much. So you're just starting to train that muscle. It will take some time. And I think also, to be fair, the private sector and business sector need to kind of step forward too. Don't wait to be invited, but actually to put out proposals and so on. There are a few bodies in Singapore that do that, unsolicited, who put out proposals and so on. And believe me, when government officers do their research, they look at all these things. They read all these things. So when something is put out from the research community, academia, they do get read. They do get looked at. So I think that's important. The other thing is that if you look at business and industry associations in some other countries, partly because governments in those countries are not so dynamic, these business associations are the most dynamic. I've gone to many ASEAN meetings. The US ASEAN Business Council and the EU ASEAN Business Council, for each meeting they come up with a report. Well thought through proposals, backed up by research and evidence, meaningful, balanced proposals. And actually the ASEAN ministers are a bit taken aback. They're not sure how to respond because this is a very in-depth kind of engagement that in this part of the world we're not quite used to. And Singapore just has to grow its muscles to engage this kind. It's not entirely new. Tripartism is a classic example of three different parties in society coming together to co-create. And that's been but that example has not extended much more beyond that. So we really need a lot more of this. It takes both parties to clap, and I think it's important that they step forward. I visited Denmark and the UK recently to find out about how they do their climate transition planning. So much of it is private sector led. So much of it. The businesses were telling us, we are telling the government to set standards, to introduce new regulation, to do this and that. And they draw proposals, they publicize it, and then they seek the government's officials and ministers to engage them in these discussions. We need to see a lot more of that kind of activity and ferment here. And I think the government will, knowing the government officials, they will welcome it. They're sincere about it. They may look very uncomfortable because they're not used to this, and they must have talking points so before they engage. But like I said, if I think we have this dynamic setup, I do think that government will be is well-intentioned, that they will also respond.
If I may also add on, since we are in the Lee Kuan Yew School, I would like to also say something on behalf of the academic community here. I think there's a lot of resource in terms of the academic community, a lot of potential to be tapped on as well. And what they need really is access to data, and also sometimes to be given some of the credit for helping to develop and co-create some of these policy solutions.
Wonderful. We are rapidly running out of time, and the timer in front of me has just started flashing. So maybe just to wrap up the conversation and just bring the session today to a close, can I invite both of you maybe just to share what's your hope for future-ready governance in Singapore, if you had one hope? I'll be curious as to where you see this going forward.
I think it's something we've spoken about, participatory governance, really, and how we can bring everybody to really feel free to contribute to the fullest in every aspect of the life and governance of Singapore.
Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah, I was about to say the same thing.
Consensus.
We really need a much more participatory governance structure. It's getting there, not quite there yet. The only thing I would add is don't wait for the government to draw people in, because that goes against the spirit of what we're trying to achieve. What we're trying to achieve is organic governance involving all parties. So don't wait for the government to invite. Knock the door. If the door is not closed, just walk in and engage. I think that's very important. And I think once we get to that kind of comfortable governance model, we can face any challenge.
Yeah. Wonderful. If you would join me in thanking both Terence as well as Ravi for their comments.
Thank you, everyone. So now I have to give the price reveal. So the book will be sold at the back of the hall. It will be at $32, a really good deal. Why? You get dinner, you get Terence to sign it for you, and it's a hardcover book. So I encourage you to get a copy. Please feel free to take pictures, and you can flex on LinkedIn that you're really future ready. With that, thank you for coming today, and enjoy the rest of the night.